We're very happy to have Charles Jencks here with us. He's an American architect and historian based in Edinburgh and the author of several best-selling books on architecture. His design work is published in The Garden of Cosmic Speculation and The Universe and the Landscape. And he divides his time between lecturing, writing, and designing in the UK and elsewhere. He co-founded the Maggie Cancer Caring Centers and continues to take an active role in seeing them develop. Among his current projects, the Krawick Multiverse is opening in 2015. He'll also be lecturing tomorrow evening, and I hope you'll all come and attend that as well at 6:30 at the lecture hall adjacent to the Archizoom gallery. He'll speak today about narratives of national and local identity.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here in Switzerland and take part in this subject on narrative and landscape. All my work is very involved with narrative. Landscape, of course, is something we're in the middle of, like death and life. And once you're in the middle of something, you can't quite see it from outside. But narrative, of course, is really key to how people think of themselves. And our own identity is very mixed up with narrative. And obviously, the identity of an individual comes from their family, their mother, above all, if you're a child. So your first identity is with your environment, your landscape of your mother. And the next one is yourself, and idiosyncratic identity comes, and then you have maybe your local family and your town, your city, your nation, the cosmos, and all the rest of it. And, well, I should mention, of course, today the digital. Everybody has a digital, not everybody has a digital, but a lot of us have a digital identity, which we can't escape. So these are all narratives of one kind and another, and they sustain us. And we try to sustain them and our own personalities and life. And the more successful we are at doing that, if we live in a perfect canton, in a perfect lake, by a perfect mountain, in a perfect city, of course we get perfectly bored. And we can't wait to escape. And we escape through our imagination and through through thoughts. So we therefore need narrative, and at the same time we try to transcend it. And transcending it through our imaginations and the landscape is a very important part of what we do. So I'm really happy to talk about narrative even very quickly. I show you some Scottish work, and I'll show you some work in Korea, which makes use of narrative. And I might say, by way of introduction, that the bigger the job you have, the more you need a narrative to keep your client and society and everybody on message. So big narrative, master narrative, the narrative of whatever you think is important, is a key idea, and you have to sell it again and again and again if you're ever going to make a landscape realized. I've been very lucky to work on my own. I've never had an office, and although I'm working with my daughter Lily, we have an office called Jencks squared, Jencks to the second power. She's the power and I'm the square. And I don't intend to have a bigger office than myself and her. Well, and she now has an office. Anyway, I've found with big projects, very big projects, a big narrative is key. And so in Scotland, where I live often, the narrative of Scotland, the longest coastline in the world, they say it's infinite, according to fractal geometry. You can see it on your left there, and you can see the four faults, geological faults. And one of our identities, of course, physical. So geology is really key. And of course, to say that in Switzerland is something you won't be surprised. So in looking at how your imagination can look at Scotland, Scotland is actually a small version of Britain, Great Britain, if you look at it very, very loosely with closed eyes. And it's also like Scotta, this mad woman on the right. It's named after Scotta, who was a mythical woman who was the daughter of Ramesses II, one of his 100 children. And she lived for 1,000 years, and she went off to Syria, of all places, and got her husband, and the two of them, she put a stone on her back and walked 1,000 miles, came to Ireland, and finally ended up in Scotland, what is now Scotland, naming it, Scota named, the Scotty tribe is named after her. So I showed her as an angry woman who walked 1,000 miles. Identity of the Scots, and I've had to design, or not had to, but I have designed many Scottish things, including this map with the four faults and other Scottish projects, including the entry to Scotland, and the one I'll show you. This is the Scottish worthies, these 17 worthies, the Scottish train of the Enlightenment that goes off by a train track, linear, very definitely a linear progressive history that is part of what Richard Sennett was talking about, ending in a train of progress. And there's one of James Hutton, the founder of the science of geology. One of the train cars is, it's all built out of scrap, as often I build out of rusted elements. And you can see his head, a rock on the side, and the train, the things of a train are his body. In fact, the old bridge is his bottom. Anyway, I was asked to get involved with Scottish coal, and over many years worked with them, and thought the site was so big, it's 2 miles square, that I didn't know what to do with it. Anything you did with it, it would disappear. Any sculpture, any landscape, it was just too big for anything. So I looked under this big sky for a theme big enough, and I found that there were 40 million Scots around the world who had settled over the last 400 years in Europe, particularly in Poland, down the Vistula River. So many red-haired Scots from Gdansk or Danzig to Warsaw and Krakow that there were 30,000 that settled in 1600, that they still have red hair on the Vistula River and are called the Gordiansky, and they have hyphenated names, hyphenated identities of half Scots and half Polish. Anyway, I found around the world there are supposed to be 40 million Scots. There are only 5 million Scots in Scotland. So the project became Scotland Around the World. And these very large earth mounds with, which the Scottish Coal Company had to dig in order to get the energy out of the ground was what they were going to do anyway. So I made a run around the Scottish world where they settled, and you can see the 4 continents. On your right, there's the continent of Europe. In the top there, the United States and Canada. They settled also a great deal in founded parts of Australia and New Zealand, where there's a great Scottish community today, and India and China. So a walk around the Scottish world, how the Scots invented the modern world, was even the title of a book written by a professor in America, and I used that as my narrative. The Scots were amazed and surprised to find that, they'd invented the modern world, but of course delighted to find this out. And they were the inventors of the Scottish Enlightenment, one of the leading Enlightenment nations, which they knew about. And I knew about because I'd done that train track of Scottish worthies. Anyway, as I was building the world, as it were, 2 miles, and designing it by the M90 for all the tourists who went north from Edinburgh, I made a Scottish loch there to the south in the shape of Scotland, and a floating island in the excavated void at the north, which you can see this floats around. And they had named it themselves, these coal men who almost never think about symbolism at all. They'd named it the Great Void because it was the last area they were cutting the earth and digging out the black gold. by this narrative, I managed to convince a lot of other people in Scotland that this was the most important project underway, open to, 2 million tourists driving on the M90. And we started to construct it, and then one thing led to another. We did build Europe, the European continent. You can see on this huge mound, which is so big that you could put a lot of the landscape I've designed inside the mound. It's so big that it dwarfs everything, even it dwarfs the helicopter that took the shot. It's overly in scale, really, with the large-scale diggers. Anyway, they had no money to build this, and so I had to build the orientation points out of throwaway material, tires and used trees, and in fact destroyed scrap metal. And while I was doing this, I thought of, the 5 or 4 layers of nature, named by Cicero and other theorists of the biological world, which is the first nature is wilderness, the second nature is an orchard or agriculture, the third nature is a garden, the fourth nature is our industrial scrap, that is throwaway material, and there's zero nature, which is the laws of nature, gravity and electromagnetism. So this site became a place where we started to build the world, and then for various political reasons, Scottish coal started to go bankrupt, and the Scottish nation got involved in this vote, for secession. And although I had predicted all of the national consciousness, 8 years previously, the Scottish people really wanted a divorce, a lot of them, but of course, as you know, not enough of them. Anyway, in the meantime, coal became anathema to the Scottish government, and so all the coal companies went bankrupt, and we only managed to build Europe, the European continent, with its 18 cities where the Scots settled, and this long avenue of scrap, rather like the avenue at the Ming tombs, instead of elephants and giraffes and so on, made out of diggers and their elements like wheels. They had a lot of wheels by the end of their digging, and most of them are bigger, much bigger than us. So this avenue ends in a sewer pipe, which is the only thing they could afford, a used sewer pipe at the end, and you walk down this amazing avenue of huge mechanical diggers, and you look at that sewer pipe, and that sewer pipe has below it a work of symbolism saying volcano, because it focuses on an extinct volcano, and it says below that 350 million years ago, which when it blew up, and its name is Beith. So you can see in the writing made out of those clinkers, black clinkers, and put in concrete, it says volcano 350 million years ago, Beith, and that's what you're looking at through that gun sight of a sewer pipe. Well, as I've just told you, this landscape really is something we're inside, and your imagination transports you out of place into another world. And so in landscape design, it's very important to feature the other and the far off and the distance. The landscape that you can see and you can imagine. So something that's real focuses in this place on the next mound, or a volcano that's so extinct that it's flat that you didn't know it was there until you read about it. And in our case, we focused on the next continent, that is here in model form. You see the American and Canadian nations who were built in large part by this exodus or diaspora of the Scottish people. Well, Scottish coal, as I've told you, went broke, and the Scottish vote occurred, and the result of that was this narrative of Scotland became impossible to talk about from any point except the political. And so all the parties decided that, in the last year, that they couldn't build something to do with coal, and so it's collapsed. So here's narrative, very big narrative, which was leading, for me at least, in the right direction to give identity to the Scottish diaspora and the 40 million Scots around the world, but it ended in catastrophe. On the other hand, and here in this same volcanic chain that I just showed you as a rather flat mound, the mountain of Beath, is this amazing Arthur's Seat, as it's called, King Arthur's Seat, which is an extinct volcano at the center of Edinburgh, the most extraordinary opposition between nature and culture that you could imagine in the Anglo-Saxon world. And so it led, when we were asked to do some Korean work on an ecological city, we did it with the Eco Line. And Korea, like Switzerland, has a series of mountains, 70% mountains surrounded by valleys and then the cities. So this one, Suncheon City, was reinventing itself as an ecological paradise. And it was thought, strapline was, we are the most successful ecology in the world because of our wetlands. So that is my daughter Lily and I, put forward a narrative of holding the line, defining the eco line, but the strong line which exists between the countryside. We turned the city inside out. So the city became the water, the river became a bridge, their mountains became the mounds, and they put this design of ours at the center of their 70 gardens that they erected. So a narrative in this case was taken over by the people of Suncheon City, who were reinventing themselves because of this wetland out here, which is supposedly one of the greatest wetlands on Earth. So an ecological project, then, the narrative of ecology, to do with an industrial city which was falling to pieces, led to our design being built very quickly, almost in a year, with these mounds that brought in the far distant mountains. And at the center, their own mountain, Bonghua Mountain as it's called, with its focal point, they performed a great open-air ceremony for the opening. We wanted to make the narrative more open and complete at the same time. So we used a method which David Hockney has developed based on Chinese scroll painting and cubism, which is to see something from all sides, in this case a self-portrait with this very important cigarette. Hockney likes to go on smoking in public as long as he can. Anyway, you can see his portrait. And we use that because the Koreans walk around their hills and mountains in great number every weekend. Although they live in the valleys and cities, they can't wait to get away into the mountains. So we did the eco line below in red, and we miniaturized the mountains literally in some cases, like the one you see in the foreground is one of our mounds, and then a background is being borrowed. So we use the tradition, which is an Oriental Chinese and Korean tradition, of taking the foreground and pulling in the background. And we miniaturized their wetlands. We did it in a way that they could literally read as a cornucopia. Here's an ancient Roman symbol of the Tiber holding a burgeoning flower of goodness. And we built that and marked it so they could see the all-important real ecology from this river, which they hadn't perceived. It was the mountains that gave the river, that gave the ecology which went 50 miles out to sea. It was interesting, although we worked with ecologists, no one put together the 50-mile ecology, and we did in this landscape. So in every way, they understood finally what we were saying, and their stork here, the hooded stork, is the symbol of the city and the regeneration of their ecology. And so lo and behold, what they did for the opening is they took our narrative, which we'd taken from them, they turned it on its head, and they performed their whole mountainscape and their whole drama of ecology versus economy, and the Industrial Revolution versus rebirth. And so the dance on the water here, you can see the hooded storks dancing to this amazing sound system that went throughout the 7 mounds and the lake, over the lake. And their medieval army came in from one side, and then the nations who were taking part in this World Ecological Festival. And then motorboats came in, singers singing traditional songs. The performance was like an Olympic opening with a singer who was a shaman brought in, a traditional animist shaman. And then the hills exploded with real explosions, and a rock band and motorcyclists, while they sprouted pylons and industrial high-rise out of blow-ups, and all of the girls were killed. The swans and stork died off as factories grew up behind it. So the narrative went on, and you can see finally the motorcycle gangs went after the stork goddess and ran her down and killed her, or not killed her, but she was carried off. And all of this was filmed, as you see in the background. So it's a media about a media about a media, all to the sound of music. And then, of course, in Beethoven's Ode to Joy ended as the young of Sunshine City came out and joined hands and sung. So here's a case of the big idea, the narrative, which is pretty obvious, pretty linear, pretty kitsch in many ways, leading to an extraordinary interaction. And I will be talking tomorrow night about the linear and nonlinear as the constraint and the non-constraints, which I think are necessary in landscape design. Thank you.
I'm very happy to be able to introduce Anette Freytag, who is Senior Lecturer and Head of Research at the Chair of Landscape Architecture of Professor Giraud at the ETH Zurich, with whom she's worked since 2005, serving as acting chair in his absence from July 2011 until June of 2012, and where she remains project leader of the Topology Project. Her dissertation on Swiss landscape architect Dieter Kienast has been awarded several prizes and will be published by the GTA in Zurich, as well as in Amsterdam. She has realized several studies on monuments such as the Garden of the Stocklet House in Brussels, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the first German World War cemetery in Flanders. Her recent research interests are centered at the intersection of art, landscape architecture, and architecture between the 1970s and 1990s. The title of her talk today is Living Down Below: How a Physical Understanding of Landscape May Help Create New Narratives. Please welcome Anette Freytag.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. Thank you very much for this very kind invitation and welcome. Well, we all know that landscape architecture can really achieve great things with its competencies and its methods. Georges Duchamp has shown it with the project on the River Aire. And to do so, landscape architecture has to interact closely with the disciplines of architecture, engineering, environmental science, hydrology, and planning. You also have to bring together science and memory to create a place that is ecologically valuable and gives people a sense of belonging. What I particularly like in Georges' explanation of the project was that they wanted to position the river in a way that it became an agent of design itself. In the case of the current regeneration project of the River Aire, the landscape architects were leading the necessary interdisciplinary teams. And I have to make one point clear. So if I talk about landscape architecture in the very limited time of 15 minutes, it's not about the discipline, it's about the method, and it's about its competences. We call it now topology, but it's easier for you to say landscape architecture. But please keep in mind these interdisciplinary teams, and everybody that adopts a landscapist attitude, and everybody can adopt it, the architects, the hydrologists, the planners, the urbanists, are here resumed under the term landscape architect. So please Forgive me that this is not really absolutely precise, but it's a concept and it stands for something. I think that's really important to clarify. Because there was a great difference between the approach of the engineer and the approach of the landscape architect. Engineers usually look at the site from above and usually in a very abstract way. They plan with the data, they plan in their offices, they plan on their computers. Remember Ellen Berger's remark, if you want to understand the terrain, don't go there. Look at the data and know how to manipulate it. This is exactly the approach that we are fighting here. Because as Georges has shown, you really have to be in the river to understand its forces. And the same applies when we talk about living in a city or its suburbs. Different modes of representation and visualization result in very different approaches to designing urban and rural areas. The traditional impersonal view from above has been with us since the Renaissance. In woodcuts, like the famous one of Venice, the picture of the city was made ex post. But in the case of models, like that of Glattal City, the model serves as planning instrument. The French philosopher Michel de Certeau has called this viewpoint the fiction of knowledge. It's the view Icarus had when he flew over the labyrinth built by Daedalus. Seen from this perspective, towns become nothing more than text. And this view is still taken by 90% of the urban planners and engineers today. And you saw this very drastically again yesterday in Ellen Bergen's lecture. From this distance, the consequences, the responsibility for the consequences a design might have for local residents is fading away. Because here you are up, but here you are down below. And living down below in so-called Glattal City means living next to an urban highway and in the flight path of Zurich's Cloten Airport. But it is exactly this loud noise, which you can only imagine in these pictures, that makes living here a business. Why? Developers have mainly built family homes here because families cannot afford expensive rents in the city of Zurich. The noise is, and I quote an urbanist from ETH, the deal for affordable housing. Although some of the most prestigious landscape architecture firms in Switzerland worked on this development, they were, as so often happens, only called in once the buildings were complete. It's the old lamento that you all know, questions about topography, the path system, the integration of existing structures or trees into the design, issues about dealing with different weather conditions, the correspondence between inside spaces, exterior spaces, all that should be central to the cooperation between architects and landscape architects. It has not been discussed. But really, I thought this was a bad example, but now that I know your EPFL campus, that's a beautiful thing, you know, compared to what you have here with the urban fabric and the landscape and the interior exterior spaces. It's disastrous, and I hope we can discuss it in the panel. Once again, the design discipline of landscape architecture struggled against its misuse of being used for nothing more than the beautification of areas surrounding buildings designed by architects. According to my hypothesis, it is not a coincidence that the landscape architects were not able to unfold their full competencies within the framework of a planning attitude that made central decisions based on a model that represents the impersonal view of God. And it is also exactly at this point that I question the theory and practice of landscape urbanism. What I like about this theory is that I'm also convinced the landscape architects are the ideal urbanists and that the landscape attitude should be the promoter of urbanism today. Where I still struggle with the program of landscape urbanism, at least how it is interpreted in such examples as the development of Glattal City, is that it only works as a strategy on the large scale. But when dealing with the small scale, it has very often little concern for the physical well-being or the interaction of humans and nature. In brief, for that, what I call the topological and phenomenological dimensions of landscape architecture, and both together create the narrative. There are a lot of issues that trouble me deeply regarding the current situation of urbanism architecture and landscape architecture. They have led me to help develop a framework and tools to recall the potentials of landscape architecture. At ETH, we call this approach topology. Because although I'm convinced we could create and maintain an environment that is both livable and beautiful, even in the midst of a rapidly changing world, I'm more and more disheartened by examples that seem determined to prove the opposite is true. This photograph of an ordinary intersection in the suburbs of the city of Zurich exemplifies our daily reality when engineers and planners think about nature. You can see that there is obviously a strong desire to get in contact with nature in the city, but the way they go about this is appalling and absurd. Yeah, okay. So you see here a pedestrian tunnel was built under a four-line intersection, but nobody wants to use it. To ease the situation, cobblestones were paved in the plaza next to it. You have two pieces of green lawn, electrical control boxes, dustbin, flagpoles, concrete planters with heather and pansies or other trees and shrubs. Then you have a bench that nobody wants to sit on, and consequently it turns its back to this patchwork accompanied by a very thin bed of roses. There is an incredible confusion of materials and plants, and the whole place is illegible and unintelligible. This occurs because in the suburbs of Zurich, a constant attempt is made to find a harmonious relationship between an urban and a rural character. This narrative fails miserably, as you see. What you see is a piece of green infrastructure, the dominant gesture of current planning efforts. The examples are interchangeable. You see here pedestrian tunnel in Tokyo, which has the same set pieces as the one in Zurich, and here an upscale playground on top of a parking garage that is surrounded by skyscrapers in Hong Kong. But it could also be Singapore or Beijing. So if I wouldn't tell you this is Tokyo and this is Hong Kong, you would have no idea. Because what these examples have in common is their detachment from the soil and the use of natural elements as set pieces that have nothing to do with the original environment. In architecture, however, this way of covering with green is used as a selling point. I show you two screenshots from a very arbitrary internet research. The catchwords, sustainable design innovation, eco-architecture, green buildings, are used when touting this new green-roofed, solar-powered library for Helsinki's city center. This is intended to appeal to our morality and to trigger our emotions, which are used like shields against any sober discussion about the quality and inherent logic of such projects. I mean, it would be extremely funny. Look at this design with the trees up there and the fountain that spills water in it and all this crazy path system. It would be extremely funny if it wasn't so tragic, because this kind of green architecture is seemingly the current fashion when it comes to designing with nature in a city. If there ever was an interaction of disciplines like planning, architecture, and environmental engineering, landscape architecture in this project, I doubt that the objective was to create a narrative in the sense of a meaningful space that has an inherent logic and is anchored in the urban fabric. And you have the same problem here. I have a clear theory why the discipline of landscape architecture is very often unable to unfold its competencies and apply its methods when they would be desperately needed. But let's focus on some possible ways of dealing with the issues I've mentioned up to now, as the time of the lecture is very limited. In the frame of the topology project that we established together with Christoph Schiro and the colleagues at the Chair of Landscape Architecture at Zurich, James Melson, Pia Fricka, Sue-Ann, Nadine Schützer, all with us today, I would like to focus on the, let's call it, physical approach towards landscape that we cultivate in our teaching as well as in our research. And as here we teach architects, engineers, and urban designers, so we are not teaching landscape architects. A good way to change something in the practice of urban design is to implement the principles of topology and phenomenology in landscape education. What I really like about Christoph Schiro's large-scale design studios at the ETH is that the different methods of site analysis are actually linked to the terrain. First, the students work with sandboxes, and it's a very haptic and playful way of understanding the site and creating their first designs. And they learn to build and rebuild, and from the beginning of the design process, they get an idea about the terrain they are dealing with. Here, for example, we are working with MI students of the Department of Engineering, where we lecture once a year for a week. And we work on a site at the Bieler See, so the Lake Biel, and Georges was mentioning the Aglo-Lac. So this is a participation in Aglo-Lac. Parallel to the work with sandboxes, design students get to know the landscape they are dealing with through digital models generated from GIS data and CNC milled models. Here you see two examples from a design studio concerned with the Delta of Dordrecht in the Netherlands. The task was to redesign the dike system and thus the landscape, and to allow for newly flooded areas in order to improve the ecological conditions of the delta. The goal was to make architectural students really understand that the difference of only 10 centimeters in the terrain may change a landscape completely when you deal with tidal activities and periodical flooding. The design studio led to a research proposal that I helped to formulate for the Swiss National Science Foundation, and Frédéric Rosanneau has won our first Research by Design Fellowship with a PhD on floodscapes, landscapes in the time of climate change. To foster a topological approach to the design of landscapes that are dominated by infrastructure, you first have to understand their complexity. And a new way of getting a physical understanding is provided by a virtual tool, the point cloud model. The model is different from others because you actually move within the terrain. You are able to make sections wherever you want. For a landscape intervention, sections provide the most important information with regard to understanding a landscape and modeling its surface. With these instruments, students are able to grasp the physis of a landscape with unprecedented precision. Once you have been trained to use the laser scanner and the software, you are able to produce such models within 3 days. For me, all these different tools and instruments create an understanding about the physicality of landscape and the possibility of physical localization, which makes them quite different from typical urban planning models as the one I have shown you from Glattal City. There is one really exciting space at Glattal City, which is the Opfika Park by landscape architects Gabriele Kiefer and Guido Hager. Opfika Park continues the long tradition of large public parks in cities. It has a 400-meter long meadow, a beach, and it can be used in a variety of ways. When at a park, it is sometimes possible to forget about the surrounding noise, the aeroplanes that pass every 2 minutes, and the adjacent highway. However, a topological and phenomenological approach towards landscape design has to integrate the acoustic dimension of landscape architecture, because the sense of the sight keeps the landscape at a distance, but through the ears, it moves in quite close. In her course in the Raumklang Labor, my colleague Nadine Schütz has been working with sound and how it might be used in landscape architectural design. She has just chartered a PhD on this subject, and once again we were successful in obtaining funding of the Swiss National Science Foundation. I am highly interested in these different approaches to the physical dimension of landscape design. As the head of research, I try to bring them together and promote these approaches because I'm convinced that this is the direction landscape education should take. And in my point of view, very obviously, research and teaching of landscape architecture must not be separated. As a last example of the output of the teaching at the Chair of Landscape Architecture, I would like to show you a video made by architectural students. In this video, you can see how the students learned about landscape topography, material and texture through a video course they took. The video is titled Topography. So you see, through their videos, the architectural students obtain an awareness of soil, of topography, of surface texture of a landscape, and how different parts of a landscape are related to each other. Through this knowledge, they should avoid to create designs such as those I showed you in the first part of my lecture. To finish, I would like to quote again Michel de Certeau. The panorama city is a theoretical visual simulacrum, in sort a picture whose condition of possibility is an oblivion and a misunderstanding of practices. The ordinary practitioners of the city live down below the threshold at which visibility begins. That is why I believe that we need this physical approach to landscape to change something in the current design practices. Thank you very much.